So Margot and Katie, thank you for joining us from the Neuroscience Training Program. And I'll turn the time over to you now.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks everyone for your patience. Just had some technical difficulties, but we're really excited to share with you about the brain. So I'm just gonna start by introducing myself. So my name is Margot. I'm a graduate student in the Neuroscience Training Program. I've been here for about 6 years at this point, so I've learned an awful lot about the brain. And my research is related to the neurobiological mechanisms of anxiety disorders with the goal of better understanding them and hopefully designing better treatments that we can use to help people that are suffering from these disorders.
And I'm Katie Bjornson. I am a third year in the Neuroscience Training Program, and I study neuropsychiatric disorders. And we look at the cell-signaling processes that underlie some of these disorders and how we can understand the way that the normal brain functions in order to understand how it can be changed and cause disease states.
Cool. So I'll just give a brief overview of the format. I'm going to be presenting and talking to you about the human brain, and we have a real human brain that we're going to use as an outreach tool, so that's very exciting. Katie will be monitoring the chat throughout, and so if you have any questions, I'm going to encourage you to post them in the chat. We're going to break at the end and answer some of those questions, but if you do have any questions about words that I use or any clarifying points about things that you don't understand, I'm going to ask Katie to interrupt me with those questions just so we can make sure that we are all on the same page about everything that's going on. So I'll just launch right in. So we do have this fantastic outreach tool, which is the human brain. So I'll go ahead and lift it up here. So this is what is inside of your head, which is a very, very cool thing to have. And so the first question, so we're doing this in a virtual format, and normally we would be at the science expeditions in the WID, and you guys would come up to the table and I would hand you this human brain and you would get to hold it in your hands, which is a really fun experience. So the virtual format is not quite the same, but we're excited to share nonetheless. So a lot of people ask me where we get this brain and how we are able to use it as a research tool. And so when you die, you do have the option to donate your body to science. And so what can be done with that is essentially if you have some sort of disorder that we're trying to figure out, what the actual mechanism is, your brain can be used for research purposes, which is really, really valuable because a lot of the disorders that exist in humans, we don't exactly have really great models for them outside of humans, since humans have really complicated disorders and disease processes. But if you're healthy, another way that your brain can be used is as an outreach tool. And so that's actually how we got this brain. And we're very, very grateful to have it because it's a really, really great way to teach people about the brain and get people excited about neuroscience, which is ultimately going to be really important because all of our research is, we get money from the general public. And so the more people know about brains, the more we can convince them that it's really important to study them and try and figure out what's going on when things go wrong. So just to orient you to the brain, this is going to be the front of the brain. Normally, when it's sitting in your head, it would be sitting like this. Underneath, you can sort of see these two indents right here, and that's where your eyes would be. So this portion we call the orbital frontal cortex because it's above your eye orbits. Then we have the side of the brain, and the brain is generally divided into some major lobes. So this would be the frontal lobe. You have the parietal lobe up here, the occipital lobe back here, and then this along the side is the temporal lobe. So basically, I'm gonna hold this up for a bit and I'm gonna ask you to sort of like look and see any defining features that you see across the brain and sort of keep those in your mind. And then I'll point out some things that are potentially interesting, and maybe Katie, if there's anything that pops up in the chat, you could relay that on to me. So what do you guys see on this brain that looks distinct or interesting to you? Any chat responses?
Not yet.
Okay. All right.
Margot, what is the back part? It looks like there is some different texture in the back. What's that little part in the back?
Yeah, so this guy right here is often something that people point out is looking different. You can clearly see that the folding structure is different in between this sort of big part up here where we have these big kind of interesting folds, and then here we have these very small, tightly packed folds. So this is called the cerebellum, which comes from the Latin for mini brain. So we have the cerebrum, which is the brain, and the cerebellum. And you can sort of see that they're actually pretty separate. I can actually pull it up here. So the cerebellum is sort of like an independent structure. It definitely communicates with the rest of the brain, but it has a very different structure and very different cell types. And we used to think that the cerebellum was really important only for like movement, balance, so a lot of the things that you do sort of unconsciously, a lot of motor patterns that are generated with things that you do a lot, so like walking, if you play any sports, any of those movements. But we've since come to learn that the cerebellum is actually a lot more complicated than we gave it credit for. So it participates in a lot of different things such as emotion, learning, a lot of different mechanisms. And so the way that it communicates with the brain or the rest of the brain is via a structure in the brainstem called the pons, which is right here. So that means bridge. And so it's essentially a bridge from the cerebellum to the brain. Something that's really, really interesting about the brain is that it's crossed, which is kind of weird, but essentially what that means is that any information from the left side of your body is going to be processed on the right side of the brain. We don't exactly know why that's the case. People think that that might be an adaptation for like survival and hunting. So it's sort of, if you like had your arm bitten off on your right side, you'd want to be able to like continue to control other things with the left side. That's not the most satisfying explanation, but it's one of those kind of weird mysteries. But the weird thing about the cerebellum is it's actually not crossed. And so there needs to be like a place where you can send all of that information over to the right side. And that's what the pons does. Another place where there are crosses, so there's going to be lots of places where information is going to cross. And so here you can sort of see, it's really hard to do on the Zoom. Sorry, everybody. Right in here, there is a little kind of X-looking structure. So that's going to be what's called the optic chiasm, which means cross. And so information, so as I said, when the brain is normally inside of the head, you have your eyes, which are going to be right here. So that's where you get a lot of information about the outside world that's going to come in. And in order to reach the right side or the correct side of the brain, it's going to need to cross. And so it does that in the optic chiasm. And so most of those fibers are going to cross over, and all of the information that's visual in your brain is processed all the way at the back here. So this is the occipital lobe, but we also call it the visual cortex. So one kind of important principle about the brain, and what a lot of neuroscientists are really focused on understanding, is what parts of the brain do different things and how do those things happen, and how are they processed inside of the brain. And so essentially across all of this squished up bit, which is the cortex, you're gonna have different areas that are specialized or preferentially do a certain thing. And that is a lot of what the neuroscience community is really interested in investigating. But
I can show a quick picture, if you'd like, of the different lobes so that we can all see that a little bit better.
yes, thanks, Katie.
Oh, are we, oh gosh.
Good, I see it. Oh, now I don't.
Do you see it?
Yes.
Great. So like Margot was saying, we have the frontal lobe, which is here in purple, the parietal lobe, which is in yellow, the temporal lobe here in orange, and the occipital lobe is in blue. And so I'll let Margot continue explaining what each of these things do. But as you saw on the regular human brain, those things are not in colored form. However, this visual image gives you a good idea of where those different parts of the brain are.
Yeah, so we do have the brain divided up into a couple of different, what we call lobes, which is just kind of an overall term that we use to distinguish them. And so the temporal lobe over here is a really important structure. And one of the first ways that we figured out what it does is through, so it's kind of hard to figure out what the brain does, right? Because for a while, we didn't have a lot of tools that allowed us to ask questions about what the brain does. And so for a long time in neuroscience, we relied on what are called lesion studies. And so that can happen when someone gets damage to a part of the brain, right? So when you have your full brain, it's normally functioning, but sometimes we do have different ways that people can get damaged. And so there's a lot of important case studies in neuroscience which have helped us to sort of unravel what these different parts of the brain are doing. And the way that we learn about that is we ask people who have damage to different portions of the brain to perform certain tasks. And if they can't do that, then we can say, okay, well, maybe that part of the brain is involved in doing this particular thing. So for the temporal lobe, you can see out here that we have all this squishy folded up stuff, which is, as I mentioned, the cortex. So one of the reasons that we have folded up cortex, so this is actually kind of unique to human brains. There are definitely other species of animals that have folded up brains, but a lot of them don't. And so one of the ways that I like to help people understand why the brain is folded up in the way that it is to imagine that your mom was like, oh, clean your room, please. And you were like, no, I'm not going to do that. And then at a certain point, she's going to come into your room and you're trying to like get as much of it out of the way as possible. So you're taking like your clothes and your blankets and you're trying to like stuff them into a place. So your clothes are normally flat, right? But when you squish them up to try and like shove them under the bed or something, you're going to fold them up and they're going to go from taking up this kind of big space to taking up a much smaller space. And so that's kind of the same thing that evolution has done to your brain, is it's essentially taken a lot of flat cortex, and in order to give you all of the brain that you need to do all of the fancy, complicated things that you do with your brain, it squishes and folds it up. And so if you didn't have folded up cortex, your head would probably be like this big, which would be really, really hard for your mom to like give birth to you because humans have limited size. And also you'd probably be walking around like this all the time, which would be very inconvenient. And so cortex, the folded up cortex, is the way in which we fit the maximum amount of brain into a pretty small head, which I think is very, very cool.
And we had a couple of third graders in the chat, or fifth graders in the chat, actually point that out and notice what those wrinkles were. So great job. Thanks for participating, guys.
Yeah, thanks for passing that along, Katie. So the folded up bits on the outside, that's the cortex, but they actually hide a bunch of structures that are living inside of the brain. And unfortunately, I can't really show you those with the brain as it is, because I would need to like cut it right down the center, which we're not going to do because we really want to keep this intact for showing you guys how cool it is. But within the temporal lobe, there are structures called the hippocampus, which is going to sort of be along here. And so one important case study in the context of neuroscience research was a patient named HM. So usually we'll talk about case studies with their initials because we want to make sure that, you know, we're not putting all their information out there. And so essentially what happened is this person, HM, had a really severe seizure disorder. So seizures are essentially—
Yeah, right when I was trying to do the new Zoom and email it to him, and then I'm still trying to figure out how to
Heidi, can you mute yourself, please?
Okay, thank you. So he had a very severe seizure disorder. And so what seizures are is essentially a lot, so the cells in your brain rely on electrical activity for communication. And Sometimes what can happen is they just go like crazy haywire and they have all this electrical activity, and then it can sort of start in one location, which is called the focus of the seizure, so the place where it starts, and then it can like move out to the rest of the brain. And so you can start with a very small seizure and then it can take over the brain. And so what doctors will do occasionally when you have very, very severe disorders like this is they'll remove the place where it starts. And the goal with that is to get you to have less seizures. And so in order to deal with HM's very, very severe seizure disorder, they removed a part of the temporal lobe called the hippocampus. And after that happened, HM could not form any new memories. So whenever a doctor would come into his room, they would be like, hello, I'm Dr. So-and-so, I'm gonna be doing this. And they would do whatever tests they were doing, they would leave. And then the next day they would come back and they would be like, hello, I'm Dr. So-and-so. And it would be like HM had never met them. So that was really interesting. But HM could still learn how to perform new tasks. He could learn how to do different things. So like the first time you do something, it's pretty hard, but then as you do it over and over again, it becomes a lot easier. So he could still do those kind of things. He just couldn't form new memories about things that had happened for him. So this was a really interesting case study because not only did it tell us that the hippocampus is really involved in memory, but it told us that memory is not like one thing, right? So learning how to do something is not necessarily the same thing as remembering new things that happened to you. So the temporal cortex is what's around the hippocampus, and we think it's also really involved in storing memories, doing a lot of like, as you walk around the world, remembering like where you're going and where you've been and directing you, and also it's right by your ears. So we do also have some of what is called auditory cortex, which takes in the sounds like you're listening to me right now and makes sense of them inside your brain.
We had a question about other parts of the brain, Margot.
Yeah.
What part of the brain makes your arms move? What part of the brain makes your emotions? And if you have a love of dance, how does your brain come up with those dance movements?
That's a really awesome question. And there are definitely parts of the brain that are involved in that. So the thing that's really cool about the brain is it's never like one region exclusively, right? So your brain is really, really interconnected. And a lot of different regions are going to actually work together to allow you to do different things. But as I said, there are certain areas that are specialized. So up here, we have what is called the central sulcus, which you can sort of see right here. So that divides the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe. So you talked about emotions. There's a lot of parts of your brain that are involved in emotions, but one of the ones that we think is very, very important is the frontal lobe, which contains what's called your prefrontal cortex. Another region that we think is really important is actually inside the temporal lobe. So it's right next to the hippocampus, which I told you about. It's called the amygdala. You've probably heard of the amygdala and heard that it was called the fear center. And so the amygdala is important in sort of like telling you what in your environment is either scary or good, and sort of making sure that you can mount the correct response to whatever is scary in there. And that is sort of what we think emotions are, is your reactions to different things in the environment that are good or bad. And then the prefrontal cortex is what I mentioned earlier, and that is going to interact a lot with your amygdala to help you sort of regulate those emotions, right? So if you see a snake and your amygdala goes like, oh my God, it's a snake, that's very scary, I should run away. But your prefrontal cortex might say, well, no, that's actually my snake in my cage. And I know that this snake is super friendly and it actually doesn't make sense for me to like panic and run away from my snake, right? So these are complementary things, right? One is really important. You need to know that snakes are scary because if you were in the wild and you saw a snake and it came after you, that would be really, really bad for you. But there's all sorts of other information that you have, which you gather as you go through the world that's sort of important for understanding what that stimulus or what that fear thing means in the context of all the other things that you've learned. So for movement, there's a lot of cortex that's also dedicated to that. So behind the central sulcus and in front of the central sulcus are what are called your motor cortex, so motor movements. And what's really, really cool about the motor cortex and something that we've learned is that it has what's called a homunculus, which is a fancy word to basically say that different parts of the motor cortex are responsible for taking in and processing information about different parts of your body. So within the motor cortex, there's like one particular spot right about here that's involved in processing information from your hand. And actually what's really interesting is it's not totally proportional. So what I mean by that is the size of your body part doesn't necessarily tell you exactly how much cortex is going to be dedicated to that. It's going to be more related to how important that particular, like how much information you need from that, right? So your hands you use for a lot of things. You interact with the world through your hands, right? And so having a lot of cortex dedicated to processing stuff from your hands is going to be really, really important. The motor cortex, I'm going to grab. So one thing that's very interesting, as I mentioned, is that the brain has two sides. And so for the motor cortex, information from the left side of your body is going to be processed in the right side of your brain. And the right side of your body is going to be processed in the left side of your brain. And you can sort of see that the two halves of the brain are actually pretty separate, right? So I can like sort of pull them apart here. So I'm going to grab the half of the brain, right, which is essentially this, cut right in half, okay? So you can sort of see there are different parts of it that look either smooth, like they haven't, or that look like the sort of outside, like they haven't been cut, and things that look like they have been cut, right? So this guy right here looks like it's been cut. And so this is called the corpus callosum. So Katie, do you mind pulling up the image of the neurons that you have on your slides?
Of course.
Awesome. So neurons look very different from lots of other cells in the body. When you picture a cell, probably what you're picturing is something circular, right? And that's true for a lot of the different organs in your body. But there are specialized cells, very special, different looking cells in the brain, and they have a very different structure than the sort of circular cell that you would normally think of. So Katie's using her pointer to sort of point that out. But essentially what you can see is that you've got the cell body. And so inside of the cell body is all of your DNA, which you may have heard of. It's got the code for what things are going to look like and what your cells are going to be making. And then what you see is that there's this very different specialized structure that's called the axon. So I mentioned before that different parts of the brain communicate with each other. And the way that they do that is through these long axonal projections. And so it's basically like a big arm that's reaching out and like tapping another brain region and being like, hey, you know, I'm doing this, you should be doing that. And so these axons can travel really, really far. So for the motor cortex, as I mentioned, which is going to be really important for helping your body move in different ways, the axons can reach all the way out and down what's called your spinal cord. So you can see that here. It's one of the things that looks like it's been cut, right? So you've got the circle at the end. So that's going to normally be going all the way down your back through your spine. And there are projections that can go out into your body and talk to your muscles and tell your muscles, hey, we want to do this thing. Let's do this thing. So that is how you plan all your stuff up here in your cortex. You've got different areas of the cortex that are responsible for, you know, moving different body parts and also planning motor sequences. So like when you reach for something, there's a particular sequence that you're normally going to use in order to reach and grab. And so that travels all down your spinal cord and out into your body. And then in the opposite direction, there's a lot of information coming back up about the feelings that you're having. So when you actually contact the glass, that's going to feel like something, right? You're going to know that you're in contact with whatever you were trying to reach out and grab. And so that information is going to come straight back up, and it's going to go to the neighboring somatosensory cortex, which is just a fancy word for body sensations. And so like the motor cortex, that's also going to have this special organization where different parts of your body are going to be sending information to different parts of the somatosensory cortex. I think there was one more element there, Katie. What did I miss?
I think you got it. You talked about emotions and motor sensation.
Okay.
And so there have been some other questions in the chat. I know we're running out of time,
Yeah.
but why is the brain dripping, Margot? What's the liquid?
That's a great question. So this brain is preserved. So you guys look at the color, you can see that it's sort of like weird and tan. And that's not actually what your brain is going to look like inside of your head. And so this is sort of because we used a bunch of different things to make sure that this brain can last a while outside of your body. So we can use it as a research tool for a while. But what it's missing is blood, right? So I can sort of show you there's like noodly bits that are coming off of the brain. You can see that there's quite a few of them, right? And there's some big ones. And so those are blood vessels. And so normally your brain is going to be pink because it's got lots and lots of blood running through it. And the blood is really important for bringing in oxygen, which is something that the neurons or the cells inside of your brain use in order to do the things that they need to do. That's their energy source. There's also lots of different nutrients. And so this is not the normal color of the brain. The color of your brain inside your head is going to be a little bit more pink. But in order to keep it fresh for as long as possible, so we can really use it as an outreach tool for a long time, we keep it inside of like a mix of water and some other preservatives. And so that's why it's dripping, is because normally it lives in a kind of jar. So yeah.
Do we know how old this brain is, Margot?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't have a lot of information about the person who donated this brain. And again, that's because of privacy. We want to sort of respect that. But we do know that they're probably an adult based on the size of the brain. So the average human brain is about 3 pounds. And so this one is probably about that, which probably means it's the brain of an adult, because if it were a child, it would be smaller. So your brain does kind of grow a lot over the course of you getting older. And actually your brain is not going to be fully grown until you hit 25. So it's one of the last parts of your body that reaches full maturity, or being, the way it's going to look for the rest of your life. As like you grow a lot taller, right? And so we don't know much else than that. And the other thing that we know is that they are healthy. So they didn't have any major brain disorders or anything like that. And that's about all that we know. We don't know man or woman. We don't know gender, anything like that. So yeah.
Great. And if there are any other questions, feel free to post them in the chat right now. I think we are about out of time, but if you do have some last minute questions, we'd love to answer more.
Cool.
I think that looks like about it. Oh, there's one more. Do brains shrink in size after you get to about 25 years of age? Do they ever change size?
Yeah, so most of the growing and shrinking, or most of the growing that your brain does, is until you sort of hit that 25. Most of it is actually happening when you're kind of a young kid. But what does start to happen at 25, or sort of as you hit adulthood, is that, so your brain has all of these connections, right? And a lot of these connections are driven by experiences that you have. And so your brain can, change, and the strength of communication between different cells and different regions that I talked about can definitely change as you have different experiences and learn different things. But generally, as you age, you're going to get a sort of decrease in the amount of connections that you have. And so it's sort of like a curve like this, where you're a kid, your brain is growing, and then you sort of hit adulthood and it's sort of stable. And then when you get older and older, it is going to sort of decrease in size. And that's actually a lot of the brain disorders that we know about, such as Alzheimer's, can involve a sort of premature and excessive or too much reduction in size of the brain.
So the other question we have is, what is the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain called?
I'm not really sure what those terms mean. Sorry. Is there any clarification on that?
Nope, that's all. I'm wondering if maybe that means the cortex or the outer cortex layers versus the inside of the brain, maybe the subcortical regions. I'm not sure, but if you want to talk about that.
Well, so there is a bit of a distinction, and we think about that in terms of evolution, right? And so there are, everybody, most animals past a certain point in evolution have a brain. And there are a lot of structures in the brain that are preserved, so they exist across a lot of species. The amygdala, for example, is one of those where, you think about the function of the amygdala, which is telling you if there's something bad or scary in your environment, and that's going to be really important whether you're a fish or a human. And so the structure of the amygdala is going to be pretty similar across a lot of animals. What makes the human brain super unique is the amount of cortex that we have. So that's going to be very different. Animals like fish don't have a lot of cortex, or any really, I'm not sure. But we have a lot of cortex, and specifically we have a lot of the frontal lobe, which is one of the most expanded in humans. And so when we think about, the complex things that we do in terms of regulating the fear. So is this fear the right thing to be doing given all of the things that I know? We have, as humans, a lot of ability to do that. And so what sort of changes is the way that we can tell what the subcortical structures, like the amygdala, which sort of just see a thing that's scary and are let's run away. We can actually interact a lot with that. And so that becomes really important. If you have an emotion, maybe you're sort of angry because you don't want to do your homework or something like that, but you know that tomorrow, if you don't do your homework, your parents are going to be pretty upset with you, and your teacher might be a little bit disappointed. That sort of process is something that we think involves all of that cortex. You can think about the long-term goals that you have. You can think about what other people are going to think about your actions. And then you can use that to sort of say, hey, amygdala, let's not do this right now. Let's actually do something else because we got to think about this future thing. So that's sort of an interaction between, I guess, the cortex, which you could call the upstairs brain, and the amygdala, which you could call a portion of the downstairs brain.
Great, and I think we have to wrap up, but there are two quick more chat questions. A fun question: can the brain mutate?
Can the brain mutate? The brain can change. So we know that through learning, you can change the strength of your brain. You can have what are called genetic mutations. And so a lot of the disorders that we study about the brain involve mutations in that DNA, which, as I talked about, is the sort of sequence that tells the brain what it should look like and what it should be making. And so you can have different mutations that cause you to not produce something that you need. An example would be Huntington's is a disorder where you have a genetic mutation that causes you to produce a weird looking protein that then can affect the way that your brain functions. And then you can also have environmental impacts that cause your brain to have some changing processes. So different things in the environment that are kind of not great, toxins and things like that, can have an influence on your brain.
Great, and the last question, what is the brain made up of?
So the brain is made up of lots of stuff. The neurons that I talked about, the axons that I mentioned, the ones that go and touch other neurons, those are covered in fat. So that's sort of the wires that you see, they're covered in plastic. That makes sure that all those electrical signals that I talked about can travel really, really long distances. There's also the blood vessels, so lots of water. There's going to be other types of cells other than neurons, so glia, which are sort of support structure. And then there's all sorts of things in between, like proteins, molecules, all sorts of like signaling things. But mostly it's made up of the cells, the fat that surrounds them, and then water.
Great, and thank you so much, Margot, for demonstrating the brain for us. And thank you to everyone for coming. We're so excited that you joined us.
Sure, and then we do have a NTP channel on YouTube, so if you do have any questions that weren't answered in this presentation, or if you have more interest in learning about the brain, we've got lots of materials out there. So thanks so much for joining us, and we really appreciate your time.